here with James Pryor of Miller Thomson in the Kitchener-Waterloo office, and his main focus, or industry expertise rather, is insurance, and his key practice expertise is commercial litigation, personal injury, and litigation. So his contact information is available, and if you have any questions after the webinar, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email and I can put you in touch with him. Thanks for coming in today, James.
Thanks, Dana. Good morning or afternoon, everybody. As Dana mentioned, my name is James Pryor. I'm a lawyer from Waterloo at Miller Thomson, and I practice primarily in the areas of insurance litigation and some commercial litigation. In a nutshell, what that means is that when a dispute gets to the stage of a lawsuit, I'm the guy that goes to court and sorts it out. So Miller Thomson, the firm, it's a full-service firm that we've got lawyers in basically every practice area you can think of. And one of the things many of our lawyers do, including myself, we have experience in the areas of risk management and risk assessment. So I've been asked to speak today on the topic of risk management in the context of helping to protect one's business. In terms of the agenda for today, I'm going to be discussing what risk management is, as well as its scope, the risk management process and programs, risk management policy statements, and risk management expertise. Now, what is risk management? Essentially, broadly stated, it's made up of three components, namely monitoring risk, assessing risk, and alleviating risk. Generally speaking, all organizations are going to have at their core the fundamental goal of survival. Beyond that basic goal, however, they also tend to have various other goals, including profit. Most businesses exist to make money, as well as growth. In order to increase profit, a lot of businesses are going to seek to grow. And some businesses also have public service as a goal. I'm thinking of entities like charities. Now, by implementing effective risk management strategies, organizations can go a long way to furthering those goals of survival, profit, and public service by minimizing the negative consequences of unforeseen risks and accidental losses. Now, if there's an effective risk management program in place, negative consequences of those accidental losses can be limited or mitigated. Now, what I mean when I talk about accidental losses are losses that are unintended or unforeseen from an organization's perspective. For example, losses from flooding are generally unforeseen and unintended, but it also extends to losses beyond pure accidents. For example, there can be losses when a key employee with specialized or irreplaceable skills resigns. In those situations, it could halt or slow production significantly if they've got a specialized skill that can't be replicated easily. Now, risk management deals with mitigating the negative consequences from those sorts of accidental losses. Risk management doesn't typically deal with positive consequences, but only negative consequences, as an organization really doesn't want to limit the positive effects of a particular action, just the negative ones. Now, in terms of potential negative consequences, it's perhaps helpful to consider an example. So consider a fire. Obviously, you've got the potential for the loss of a building, which is going to cost money to repair. Beyond that, though, there's also the potential for business interruption losses, so the loss of revenue by the fact that when the facility's down, it can't be producing whatever widgets or any sort of other product it produces. When business is down and not operating, there's also the potential for loss of market share. You may find your customers may take their business elsewhere as they can't wait around for you to get your production facilities up and running again. So we can see just from that one example, there's hundreds of examples, that a rather innocuous accident like a fire could have dire consequences to a business as a whole if it doesn't have an adequate risk management system in place. Now, a good risk management program also helps to identify opportunities associated with risk, which may not make sense at first glance, but I'll try to explain. Risk, it can be a good thing. essentially at its bottom line, risk involves uncertainty about outcomes, whether they're positive or negative. So there can be positive outcomes. For example, we'll take the fire example. In the event that a facility is destroyed by fire, it may cause the organization to consider what caused the fire and whether that previous production facility was functioning at an optimal level. So this could leave room to consider improvements to the production processes of the building when it gets rebuilt, which could ultimately lead to increased productivity in a rebuilt facility. Now, the next thing I'd like to discuss is the scope of risk management. I think I've already said it, but the concept of risk management is very broad in scope and applies across all kinds of fields and industries. For example, banks and financial institutions have risk management systems, as do corporation, public entities. They all use risk management techniques to make their endeavors less risky. Now that said, a risk in one industry may not be a risk in another industry. So risk management and risk management programs and processes are not going to look the same across the board, and they've got to be tailored to the specific needs of each individual organization. Now, when we talk about risk in the context of risk management, there are two broad types. One is business risk, and this is purely speculative in nature, and it involves the inherent risk involved in any organization that will suffer a loss, gain, or either no loss or gain. There's also hazard risk, which is also referred to as pure risk, and it generally arises from accidental losses like natural disasters or workplace accident. It typically affects property, liability, and personnel loss. Now, bearing in mind the type of risks that most organizations face, they employ the concept of enterprise risk management in an effort to manage all of the organization's key business and hazard risks, with the intent behind that be to maximize the value of the organization. Enterprise risk management essentially involves trying to have an organization achieve its greatest productive potential by focusing on the organization as a whole to ensure that it's managed in an optimal way in the face of negative risks. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the traditional risk management process. Now, risk management in the traditional sense, it's the process of making and implementing decisions that will minimize the adverse effects of accidental losses on an organization. In essence, it's the process of creating a system that helps an organization to reduce potential negative consequences that accidents may have on the organization. Now, the risk management process begins by making decisions to minimize the adverse effects of accidental losses on an organization. Now, this involves essentially 6 steps. First, you've got to identify the loss exposures. Once the loss exposures have been identified, you've got to analyze them. After that's been done, the risk management professional has to go on and examine the feasibility of different risk management techniques. After that's done, they've got to select the appropriate risk management technique and then implement it. And then finally, the risk management program involves monitoring the results of the risk management techniques that have been employed and revising the risk management program where appropriate. Now I'm going to talk about each of these steps in a little bit more detail now. So step 1 is to identify loss exposures. Now this involves pinpointing potential areas in which an organization may sustain a loss. Now there are various different types of loss exposures. So for instance, there's property loss exposures. For example, a factory may be located on a floodplain. So for that particular factory, a property loss exposure would be the potential loss of its building due to floods. Another type of loss exposure is liability loss exposures. So for example, you may have a transport company that faces the potential of being sued if one of its trucks is involved in an accident. You've got the potential for liability there of being sued by somebody else. There's also personnel loss exposures. So for example, personnel loss exposures could result through workplace accidents. They may be working in a factory where their likelihood of injury is higher than if they were working somewhere else. There are also net income loss exposures, and these are essentially any sort of loss exposure that has the potential to decrease an organization's net income. Now, there are various ways that an organization can identify the potential loss exposures that are particular to its own business. First, they can complete what are called risk assessment questionnaires. This involves essentially giving key employees, or even all employees depending on the size of the organization, a questionnaire and essentially asks them to identify what they see as loss exposures that could affect the organization. As to whether an organization wants to apply these questionnaires across the board to every employee or maybe only to certain key employees or managers will really depend on the nature of the organization and how much detail they want to get into. But it's essentially like taking a poll and collecting data from a wide array of different people to see what the potential loss exposures may be. There's also what are called loss histories. And this involves essentially just maintaining a record of past losses, which will give an organization an indication of what sorts of losses have happened in the past, as well as the potential, which may suggest to the organization that, hey, if this happened in the past, it may happen again, so we need to be aware of it. Financial statements and other accounting records are also a good source of identifying potential loss exposures. And what I mean by that is an organization can use these records to perhaps identify spikes in expenses that may have been related to remediating a specific loss. Or you could notice decreases in revenue that are associated with a particular loss. So while the financial statements will show you the numbers in terms of increases in revenue, decreases in revenue, sometimes you got to go a little bit deeper and see to look for what caused those spikes and decreases in revenue. A lot of the times it could be as a result of a loss. You can look at other records and documents within the organization. Perhaps incident reports are maintained, things of that nature that can reflect whether a loss has occurred. And then in terms of organizing all of these different data sources, it's often helpful to use flowcharts and organizational charts. This helps to ascertain the relationships between various sorts of losses, and it provides a good pictorial representation of different losses. You can also identify losses through personal inspections. So for example, you can go through a facility and check whether any loss exposures can be identified in that regard. A lot of the times a walkthrough will help to identify potential issues. And then you can also look to experience within and beyond the organization. So you can ask long-time employees within your own organization or within related industries to ask them what they've identified or seen as potential loss exposures in the past that could be applicable to your organization going into the future. Now, the second step in the risk management process is to analyze those loss exposures that you identified in step one. So this involves considering those loss exposures in a little bit more detail in terms of the criteria here listed on the screen. So first, you're going to want to consider the loss frequency. So you're going to ask, once a potential loss exposure has been identified, is how frequently does this particular loss occur? It may be that losses associated with one type of risk occur more frequently than losses associated with another type of risk. So for example, fires may occur more frequently within an organization than damage by tornadoes. So an organization may want to take steps to focus its steps on remediating and preventing fires as opposed to dealing with tornadoes or other more remote loss exposures. You're going to also want to consider the severity of the various loss exposures. So you're going to ask, how severe is this loss going to be if it happens? It may be, for example, that losses associated with some type of risk are not going to be as significant as losses associated with another type of risk. For example, the losses associated with a flood or a fire may be less severe than the losses associated with a tornado. So that's something to bear in mind when assigning priority to how you want to deal with these various types of loss exposures. You're going to also want to consider the total dollar losses. So what's the total value in terms of dollars that this particular loss exposure has caused your organization in the past? If it's a very high dollar value, you may want to make that a priority in terms of dealing with and responding to that sort of loss exposure, more so than you would if there's a loss exposure that causes less total dollar value losses. You're going to also want to consider the timing of certain losses. When during the year do these sorts of things occur? Is it during a time when you've got high production, or is it a time when your production is lower and you can afford to maybe take more losses during that time? And then finally, you're going to also want to consider the data credibility. So you're going to want to consider the validity of the data that's forming the basis of your risk analysis. If it's questionable, you may want to look elsewhere and for more information. If it's very solid data, you may want to rely on that. So once the risk has been identified and analyzed, it's time to examine the feasibility of different risk management techniques. So first off, an organization can try to manage its risk by controlling it through various techniques. So for example, it can avoid risky activity through risk avoidance. If it seeks to avoid a risky activity, it's going to eliminate all potential losses flowing from that activity. That said, it also eliminates the chance of profit from that activity. So while it may seem at first sight a good thing to avoid a particular activity, if you're able to draw profit from that activity, it may not be feasible to completely avoid it, in which case you've got to look for other means to control the risk of that particular activity. So you can also try to prevent losses in terms of loss prevention. As I said, you may not want to avoid a risky activity entirely, but you may take steps to minimize the adverse consequences that are incidental to it. This might involve doing things such as installing a fire suppression system. So for example, a pizza parlor, they need to operate their ovens in order to work. There is the risk of fire there, but if the pizza company avoided using its ovens, it wouldn't be able to generate any profit or stay in business. So rather than avoiding that activity altogether, it may want to do things such as install a fire suppression system, locate in an area near a fire station, things of that nature. So while you don't completely avoid the risky activity, you do take steps to prevent losses and reduce the negative consequences flowing from potential losses. Organizations can also help to control risk by separation, duplication, and diversification of its business. So an example may be useful to illustrate that point. So let's say a plant, a business operates exclusively from one facility, and it produces widgets exclusively from that one plant. Now, if there's a fire in that one plant that destroys it, that company's ability to produce its widgets or whatever else it produces is completely wiped out. Now, if the same company that also produces widgets has two production facilities, a fire at one of those facilities is not going to shut down the business as a whole. Hopefully, the business can relocate its production from the damaged facility to the operational facility and stay in business that way. So it's not going to sustain a total loss of revenue by a fire. So in that case, by separating its business, it allows it to continue being operational in the face of losses. businesses may also want to diversify their business. Or organizations may also want to diversify their businesses. So it may produce widgets and something else. If there's no longer a market for widgets, it can still fall back on whatever else it produces to keep its business operational, hopefully. So organizations can also control risks by trying to separate their production facilities and diversifying the sorts of services and goods they provide. Now, instead of controlling risk, organizations can also try to finance the negative consequences associated with risks. So, for example, they can transfer the negative consequences of certain losses by way of insurance. Take an example of a fire. An organization's building may sustain a fire and they may lose that building. The negative consequences aren't going to be as bad if that company has insurance that will cover the replacement cost of that building. If they don't have insurance, though, that could lead to the bankruptcy of the building. If it costs too much to repair it, then just cut your losses and declare bankruptcy. So you can mitigate the effects of risky business by having insurance and things of that nature in place to deal with the potential negative consequences of loss. An organization can also transfer risk by way of waivers and things of that nature. Now what that will do is it will minimize liability loss exposures. So if, for example, you get your customers to sign a waiver and assume responsibility for any losses that flow from your goods or services, they're not able to come back at you after the fact and pursue you for damages. So you're not going to sustain a loss in that regard. So insurance and waivers are two ways to transfer the negative consequences of risk to other entities. In the case of insurance, you transfer it to the insurer, who will hopefully pay any damages of the risk insured, associated with the risk insured. And through things like waivers, you can transfer the risk to other parties who sign your waivers. Risks can also be retained internally within the organization. So, for example, if an organization knows that it regularly faces one particular type of loss, it may maintain a reserve fund that's meant to deal with those losses. Now, the benefit of doing that is that when one of these losses do come to fruition, the company's prepared for it in terms of resources that it can muster to pay for help rehabilitating that loss. If there isn't such a fund in existence, the organization could have difficulty coming up with the funding and resources to respond to that loss, which could be quite detrimental to the business. It could effectively stop the business if the loss is severe enough. Now, the next step in the risk management process is to select an appropriate risk management strategy. Now, this essentially involves two processes, the first of which is forecasting. Now, forecasting the effects that available risk management techniques are likely to have on an organization's ability to fulfill its goals. So remember I talked about survival, profit, and the like being an organization's goals. It involves comparing those effects on the costs of these risk management techniques. So it may be in some cases that certain techniques are just too costly and it's better to run the risk of engaging in an activity that will lead to a certain loss. That's essentially just a cost-benefit analysis. If it's going to cost too much to try to mitigate the risk, it may be better just to go ahead, pursue the activity, and run the risk and deal with the consequences thereafter if the risk management techniques are too expensive. Then once that's been done, an organization has to measure how well the risk management techniques are fulfilling the organization's goals. So if the particular techniques that are in place now aren't fulfilling the goals anymore, it's time to reconsider whether other techniques should be employed to manage these risks. Now, the next step after selecting risk management techniques is to actually implement those techniques that have been selected. Now, this can be done at a technical level using experts, as well as at a managerial level within the organization. Now, the final step in the risk management process is to monitor the results of the risk management techniques that have been selected and to revise them in the event that they aren't achieving their intended results. Now, this is going to be an ongoing process as the techniques need to be constantly reevaluated in light of changing circumstances. For example, what might be a loss exposure today for an organization may not be tomorrow. What I mean is, take an example. Let's say we've got an organization with its production facilities located on a floodplain. Right now, the risk of flood is pretty apparent. However, if they relocate their facility more inland, the risk of flood decreases. So, if an organization was investing a lot of time into managing the risk of flood, it's going to want to reconsider whether it needs to do that anymore and perhaps reallocate those resources to another area of risk within the organization. Perhaps the organization was relocated to an area with a high volume of traffic. There could be more motor vehicle accidents amongst employees there, so they may want to reallocate their resources into mitigating those sorts of risks. So it's essentially an ongoing process in which you've got to monitor the nature of your business and the sorts of risks that are associated with it at any given time, and consider whether the risk management techniques you are employing are still applicable. It could also be that changes in technology lead to new ways of dealing with loss exposures that may be more efficient than existing models. For example, more sophisticated fire suppression systems may be developed. So what your company was relying on before, perhaps just a fire extinguisher, may be outdated, and you may want to look into getting a more sophisticated system that will help prevent fires. Also, the legal requirements of an organization change from time to time. What your company may be legally obligated to do now may be different in the future. It's impossible to say what sorts of changes will come down the line, but you've got to be prepared to reconsider whether you are properly managing the risks of those legal requirements at any given time during your organization's lifespan. So that was a lot, but in essence, the risk assessment process can be boiled down to these broad steps. So planning, organizing, leading, and controlling the risk. Now I'd like to move on to discuss risk management programs. Now a risk management program is essentially it's a system of planning, organizing, and leading and controlling the resources within an organization in order to protect itself from the adverse consequences of accidental losses. The risk management program is going to need to foster and support an organization's overall goals, whatever those goals may be. So, no matter what the nature of your business, your risk management program has to further the end goals of that organization. Different organizations can have different goals, but for the most part, most organizations have these essential goals that are on the screen right now. So what I mean when I say pre-loss goals, I'm talking about the goals of the organization before an accident occurs. So the first goal of most organizations is economy of operations. Your company is going to want to ensure that its running in an organized and efficient way, the most efficient way possible. You're also going to want as a goal tolerable uncertainty. Now what I mean by that is we can't predict if or when every potential loss exposure is going to occur, but we need to be able to have sufficient resources in place to tolerate those potential losses when they do incur. You want to be able to tolerate that uncertainty. You don't want to be running a business where you don't know whether you're going to be able to operate in a week from now if there's a certain accident. You want to be able to have confidence that even if something does come up, an unexpected loss, your business is going to be able to survive it and move ahead. Another pre-loss goal is that of legality. Most organizations, maybe not all, but I think hopefully most, want to comply with applicable laws and regulations that are in effect at any given time. Another pre-loss goal for a lot of organizations is social responsibility. Some companies feel the need to operate in a socially responsible manner. For example, you've got Coke and the polar bears supporting that. I mean, it may not be purely altruistic why Coke does that. I mean, they get a lot of good press because of it, but a lot of organizations do feel that they have an obligation to be socially responsible. Now, those are the pre-loss goals. Post-loss goals, so what I mean is after an accident occurs, organizations have these broad goals. So the first most basic goal after an accident an organization will have is that of survival. It's going to want to recover from the loss and get back to business as normal as soon as possible. Now, once it's got back up and operational, you're going to want your operations to continue. So tied to survival is the ability to continue operating after a loss. So the most basic thing is to survive the loss, and then once you've survived that initial loss, you want to get your operations back and running as soon as possible. Once operations have been continued and resumed, the next step is profitability. You're going to want to, at a certain point after a loss, hopefully as soon as possible, begin to turn a profit again. And then once profits start turning, you're going to want to stabilize that earning capacity on a consistent basis, as you were hopefully doing before the accident. And then once those goals have been satisfied, the next thing on the list would be social responsibility. So Coke, for example, if it has a massive destruction of its production plants, its top goal is probably not going to be supporting the polar bears. They're going to want to get their operations up and running first, turning a profit, and then maintaining that profit into the future. Once all that's been done, fine, some money can start going back to the polar bears. And then the ultimate post-loss goal would be that of growth. So at that stage, you overcome all of the adverse effects of the loss, and you can move ahead and start growing your company again. Now, often, an organization can't achieve all of its goals simultaneously. For example, there could be there's a dichotomy between the relationship between legality and social responsibility versus economy of operations. A lot of the times, it may cost more to operate in a legally and socially responsible manner. An organization is going to need to choose whether it wants to do so or whether it wants to skirt the law and social norms to save a buck. So there is a lot of times you can't necessarily satisfy all these goals at once, and it does require some picking and choosing. With that in mind, an organization is going to have to consider the costs of the alternative risk management techniques and the benefits of each. I'm sure there are circumstances where an organization could invest a ton of money into preventing certain losses, but at a certain point, the business needs to consider whether it wants to invest all that money or whether it wants to simply go ahead and run the risk of committing the sustaining the loss. Now, in terms of the actual risk management department structure, if an organization does have one in place, it goes something like this. It'd vary in the size and complexity of the organization. For example, in smaller companies, they may not have the resources or funding to maintain a full complement of risk management professionals. So in smaller companies, a single individual may be responsible for managing a company's risk. In more complex and sophisticated organizations, it may be multiple departments working together and cooperating with each other to manage the risk. After all, an organization, it's the sum of its parts, so you need all parts on board to effectively manage the risks of the organization as a whole, as oftentimes there's a lot of interrelatedness between the different departments of an organization. So it's really going to vary depending on the size and nature of the organization as to how comprehensive and how big of a risk management department you're going to have. As I said, the responsibilities of a risk management department would be to establish a risk management program, continuously assess the risk with a view to controlling it into the future, and to ensure that appropriate risk financing techniques are also employed to mitigate the potential consequences of loss exposures. The next thing I'd like to discuss are risk management policy statements. Now, what a risk management policy statement is, it's essentially a tool that communicates the goals of the risk management program and the roles that the individuals in the organization need to play in order to help the organization achieve its risk management goals. In terms of its purpose, it's essentially there to establish what the goals of the risk management program are and to define the responsibilities of key personnel in achieving those goals. It also establishes communications channels between the risk management team and coordinates how losses are to be dealt with on a standardized basis. So it'll spell out what to do in the event of a particular loss. So for example, in the loss of a building due to fire, it'll give whoever is reading the policy an idea of who to contact first, and then what needs to be done thereafter in order to get the organization's operations back running normally as fast as they can. Now, in terms of the essential elements of a risk management policy statement, you're going to want to have it individualized to your organization. There's no catch-all template that all organizations can work from. The risks associated with a pizza parlor are very different than the risks associated with a technology company. So you're going to want your risk management policy statement to speak to the risks that your organization faces rather than broad general risks. The more detailed it is, the better it is for your organization, and the easier it will be to implement it in the event that your organization does sustain a loss. So you're going to want to begin with a general description of risk management and its importance within your organization. So what it is within your organization that the risk management process is going to help to accomplish. You're also going to want to indicate in the risk management policy statement the position of the risk management personnel or the department within the overall organization. So it should be drafted in such a way that whoever picks it up will know who to go to first in the event that a loss is occurring or has occurred. From there, hopefully that risk management personnel or department will know in more detail what to do next in the event of a loss. So it's going to want to describe the reporting relationships between various departments in the event that a widespread loss occurs. You're going to want to know who to contact in each department that's affected by the loss. You're also going to want to outline in that risk management policy statement the scope of the authority and responsibility of the senior risk management professional. So you're going to want to spell out what that individual's responsibilities are and the sort of authority they have to accomplish those goals. And then finally, you're going to want to make sure it clearly states the risk management goals. So spell out what it is you're seeking to accomplish. A lot of the time, most of the time, it'll be continuity of operations. You're going to want to deal with the risk and get your business running back normally as fast as possible. So moving along, I'd like to talk a bit about risk management expertise. Now, if an organization is big enough, its risk management professional should, if it has one, should have a working knowledge of all of the diverse loss exposures that the organization faces. It's no good to have somebody managing the risk who doesn't understand the nature of the organization and all the risks that it faces. You can have a risk management professional with a lot of experience, but if they don't have a knowledge of your particular business and what it needs to continue operating and the potential losses that it does face, it's not going to do a lot of good. The bottom line is you've got to be able to recognize the losses that face your unique organization and deal with those. So it's important to have a risk management professional that is able to understand the nature of your business and the nature of the potential losses it faces. Now, in order to complement their broad knowledge, risk management professionals should be able to access the specialized knowledge of experts both inside and outside of your organization in relation to its particular loss exposures. So the risk management professional, it may want to contact the senior personnel within your organization to see what they see are the risks and how they would go about dealing with them. And then it can be for the risk management professional to coordinate more globally throughout the organization how they should be dealt with. It also doesn't hurt to go to an outsider to get their input as to what sorts of risks they face and how they deal with them. It'll depend on the nature of your relationship with those outsiders, and a lot of the times they may not want to share. But if you can get some insight from a related business, it will go a long way to give you a sense of the sorts of losses you may be exposed to that you didn't even think of. I like to say that it's good to get opinions from as wide an array of sources as possible. You don't want to leave any stone unturned when it comes to managing your company's risk. Now, in terms of different sorts of experts you can turn to, there are operational experts within organizations that can speak to the operational success of the organization. So this would be people like managers or senior engineers, things of that nature, who know how the organization works and know what doesn't work in the organization. In a risk management context, they may be asked to consider the implications and risks of certain activities or processes that they are responsible for. So it may be that you have a manager or an organization or an engineer that's responsible for a particular task within an organization. Now he or she may be able to speak to the potential risks associated with that activity more so than just the general risk manager. So you're going to want to actually turn to the people within your organization who know the risks. The next thing you want to do, there's also specific risk management experts who have experience in conducting claims audits and developing safety programs. Now, beyond that, you may need to go out for input from other professionals, such as lawyers or accountants, who can comment on an organization's compliance with various laws or tax requirements. It may be that your organization is not up to date on the current state of the law or income tax requirements. So in those cases, you may want to seek the counsel of outside sources such as accountants or lawyers who are more well-versed in those areas and can tell you what your obligations are and associated risks of doing or not doing a certain activity. Now, for organizations that don't have a dedicated risk management department, then as well as relying on the expertise within the organization and professional services of others, they may want to periodically hire risk management consultants who are well-versed in assessing and managing risk. While they may not have experience in your organization's particular activity, they can learn it, they can make inquiries as to what your organization needs, and then apply their knowledge of the risk management process and different ideas of how to finance and manage risk in order to help you formulate a risk management program for your organization. Now, these individuals would be organizations with expertise and experience in risk management. For example, at Thomson, we've got various lawyers who are certified risk managers and can offer risk assessment-based advice touching on multiple practice areas in order to help organizations manage, control, and finance risk. Some of the things that these certified risk managers are able to do, they can offer legal risk audits, so they can give you an idea of your company's compliance with legislation and regulations. They can conduct audits in the areas of intellectual property, potential occupiers' liability claims, what you should be doing in order to mitigating those. They can give you advice on risks associated with labor and employment obligations, occupational health, safety, and violence and harassment in the workplace. They can help you formulate plans in order to help safeguard against risks associated with those things. Miller Thomson specifically can offer risk management planning, training, and education to create and evaluate risk management policies and procedures if you're not able to do so within your organization as a whole. So essentially that's risk management in a nutshell, which concludes my presentation. If you have any questions or would like advice related to your particular organization, don't hesitate to contact me. I believe my contact information was presented at the start of this presentation, but in case not, it's jprior, P-R-I-O-R, at millerthomson, Thomson with no P.com, and my direct phone line is 519-593-2429. So thank you very much, everybody, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us.
And thank you for presenting today, James. As James mentioned, his contact information will be available, and we'll be posting the slides as well as this webinar on our website probably within the next few days. So thank you very much, and I hope you all have a great day.